Hey, 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 hey. WeatherBrains episode number 559. This is the pre-show magical part of the show in which we do three things. We share boring personal stories, humorous anecdotes, and say outrageous things. And I think for the first time ever, as I look down at our panelists here, I'm not seeing a single bit of video coming back. Brian has a still picture, and Nate and Aubrey are muted. So now we see Brian. Brian has a blue shirt on. Now we see Aubrey. Aubrey has a lovely purple dress, maybe.
Thank you.
And Nate is being off camera. So busy with tropics. And you know what? Guess what the subject is going to be tonight? The tropics.
Fancy that.
So can't wait to have Phil on the show here. He's the best tropical tweeter in the world.
He is, isn't he?
His stuff is good. I mean, his facts are just excellent. So we're going to have him on and talk about Matthew and see if it's going to bother Aubrey and Nate. You guys are probably too far inland.
Yes, because inland flooding never happens from hurricanes.
Never.
What world are you on?
And it never rains in Southern California.
Never rains in Alabama.
No.
What I think is concerning is that that Norfolk, Virginia Beach, that Carolina coastal area just had a foot of rain.
Brian, why are you laughing?
Because I thought she was going to refer to how badly they flood, which we found out when we were there from the NWA.
Yes.
They're in deep trouble.
Yeah, this is going to be it's going to be a week of weeping and gnashing of teeth in weather offices up and down the eastern seaboard. And there's going to be a pretty sharp cutoff, I think, on the western periphery of this thing, where basically nothing happens, and then you get into it, and you're going to have flooding and all kind of issues. So, but I guess the analog of choice is Hazel from 1954, and yes, that was even before I was born. Brian, were you around in 1954?
I was. Unfortunately,
you remember Hurricane Hazel?
I do not remember Hazel. I was just a young whippersnapper.
Yeah, young whippersnapper. So let's see if I can do a screen. We're not on the air yet. No, we were on the air, but we're not in the show yet. But so this is the track of Hazel from 1954. And it looks like Matthew is going to be farther west, closer to Florida, but that landfall point is pretty darn similar to what the GFS has suggested.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it doesn't. Instead of going north, it kind of goes northeast up toward the Outer Banks and the Tidewater there. But you know, it's early in the game. We'll talk with it. Nice having a tropical guy on here. So let's see. Bill Murray is out. He is, what's he doing? What do you say? Is he in Washington, D.C.?
He's buying a hotel or something. I don't know.
For those that don't know, Bill is in the hotel business. That's how he derives his income. Although we make a vast salary on this show, he just thought he needed to pad his income a little bit.
Wait, we what?
we make a vast income on this show.
I guess I haven't been getting my checks.
Your income is warming the hearts of thousands and thousands of weather enthusiasts. So there.
And that's supposed to make me feel better.
Yes.
I'm going to have to send Bill a message and see if he's going to be out in the Shenandoah Valley while he's in the D.C. area.
So where are you heading Thursday?
How do I put this? It's embarrassing.
Oh, no. That's all right. You don't have to put it.
No, I'm not getting a prostate exam. By the way, guys,
too much information.
Guys, if your doctor has both hands on your shoulder during a prostate exam, you've got a problem. So no, there's a function at the University of Alabama. I am being inducted into the University of Alabama School of Communication Hall of Fame.
Wonderful.
I thought they reserved that for dead people. I said, "Do you guys know something I don't? Am I terminal here? I mean, is it about to happen?" So no, I'm very honored. I mean, it's just, and I told them when they called me, I said, "Guys, I don't know anything about broadcasting. I've been working in these TV stations all my years, but I really don't." And the other funny thing, earlier this year, I went to Cincinnati, and I was inducted into the Theta Tau Professional Engineering Fraternity Hall of Fame. And it's the same thing. I said, "Guys, I've not worked a minute of my life in engineering." But they said some of their alums went on to, do other things. And so, okay. So, but I saw some great friends I've not seen in a long time. That's a marvelous fraternity. But this thing at the university, there's 4 people going in this year. I'm one of them. Eli Gold is one of them.
Wow.
For those that don't know, Eli is the radio voice of the University of Alabama Crimson Tide. And then a guy named Rick Bragg. Rick is a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer. He really deserves it. He is brilliant. Wrote for the New York Times, and his writing is stunning. If you want to see a stunning piece of writing, read his piece in the New York Times on the March 27th, 1994 Palm Sunday Piedmont tornado, Brian.
Yes. I've read it.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, that's great.
He says the things I wish I could say. I wish I could take one of his classes. So maybe I'll ask him Thursday. So I guess the question is, do I need to invite Phil? And I probably do. So let's do that. And I notice our live viewing audience is much higher than normal.
I hope that's good.
I find Phil with a picture of a hurricane. That's his icon. This has got to be him. So I've just invited him. And with the new, YouTube originates this now, not Google Hangouts, and might take some engineering. We've learned the higher the IQ of our guests, the harder it is to get them on the show with the Hangout platform. I guess this is still the Hangout platform, but it's not on Hangouts, it's on YouTube. So,
which explains why James is here every week.
Every week, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I'm the first guy in. I'm the lowest IQ on the staff.
Doesn't explain why these invitations come only via email, and then you can't get in.
Who says things that you want to say? I came in at the end of that.
Rick Bragg. Rick is a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer he wrote for the New York Times for a long time. And he's going into the University of Alabama Hall of Fame Thursday. And I just wish I could write like this guy. I mean, goodness, in fact, let me pull this thing up.
I was just trying to find it. I was going to put it in our show notes.
Yeah, this is it. New York Times.
Yeah,
right,
I got it
here. I'll do a screen share. But this is like awesome. The opening line on Bragg's piece, and understand this was a tornado that killed 20 people in a church during the morning worship service. This is a place where grandmothers hold babies on their laps under the stars and whisper in their ears that the lights in the sky are holes in the floor of heaven. This is a place where the song Jesus Loves Me has rocked generations to sleep, and heaven is not a concept but a destination. Yet in this place where many things, even storms, are viewed as God's will, people strong in their faith and their children have died in, of all places, a church. And it just goes on, and it's just a fantastic piece of writing. So,
1994?
Yeah. This was the Piedmont tornado, Kevin. We were at Channel 6, and I think you had left at that point.
Yes.
Dan Satterfield was live from Piedmont. I remember he was doing a live shot, and he had to take cover because of another severe storm. But it was a Sunday morning. There was a tornado warning 12 minutes before the church building was destroyed, and they never heard it.
Right.
Never heard it. And one of those that died was Hannah Clem, the 4-year-old daughter of the pastor, Kelly Clem. And they were doing an Easter drama on Palm Sunday morning. And if you go search YouTube, we've got we did a special.
No, I remember that. I've seen that. Yeah.
Goodness, I was the first one to speak in the new church when they rebuilt that church building. They wanted me to come do the first message, and boy, that was hard. And the first thing I told them, I said, if you're looking for a theological reason why this happened, I'm not your guy. I'm just here to encourage you. And that has always been like an extension of my family. I just love the people there. And I know, Brian, you've close to it as well, since you're working at the weather service back then.
Absolutely. That was a heck of an event, and the week after was one that I'll never forget, but it went by in a flash.
Yeah. So, Nate, I've invited Phil by his Google ID.
You have a link that you can email me for this hangout, and I'll email it to him.
You know, the links I get, I've got the YouTube page and the video embed. There's not really a show page anymore, since they moved away from Hangouts.
The Hangout itself, the Hangout window, does that have a link? I've got 2 computers here, and I can't cross copy.
I don't think so.
Weird, my setup here.
I honestly don't think so.
Bill suggested was to take the URL and email it to him at time.
There's 2 Phil Klotzbachs in the directory. I invited both. One had a hurricane logo, and that had to be him.
I'm going to guess that.
Yeah, and let me just welcome our television audience. We have been here for 1 minute, so I typically do it earlier, but welcome. It's 30 after the hour. We're going to start the WeatherBrains show here in a matter of moments. So just hang tight. We're going to talk about Matthew. We have a world-renowned tropical expert coming on the show.
We hope.
We hope. And if not, Aubrey becomes our hurricane expert because she's good.
And having met her, I can attest that she's very good.
I did live through Hurricane Gloria.
Alicia, Donna.
That was we spent. I mean, growing up in Connecticut, we didn't get tornadoes and storms. We rarely got a thunderstorm. So when Hurricane Gloria came through, we spent the whole day down in the basement. And the power went out and the trees were down and stuff. That was, that's I still remember that. And gosh, I must have been, when was Gloria?
Careful, you'll give away your age. 28 or so.
85. So I was 4.
Let me share my boring personal Gloria story.
But I was 4, and I have vivid memories of that.
Wow. So I was working at Channel 4 in Dallas when Gloria was coming up, and I got a call from the news director at Channel 4 in Dallas. I'll never forget this. I was watching Gomer Pyle on television. Don't ask me why. I was watching Gomer Pyle. It was like 12 noon, and the news director called me up, and he said, "You're doing a live shot today." And I said, "That's great. Where's the live shot going to be?" And he said, "The National Hurricane Center." And of course, I said, "Come on."
Love you, dear.
What? Show title. Wow. So the news director said, "No, I'm serious, the National Hurricane Center." But the long story short, he had a Lear jet waiting on me at the Addison airport and drove over there from Plano, flew on the Lear down to Miami, and by golly, we got on the air at 5 o'clock with a live shot during Hurricane Gloria in Dallas Fort Worth. This wasn't even remotely close to this, but back in the 80s, it was power journalism. These television stations just had so much money. It was like printing money, and they did stuff like that all the time. So Phil, can you hear us?
I can hear you just fine. You're talking about Hurricane Gloria. That's what got me interested in hurricanes.
Oh,
right.
Yeah.
Weird coincidence.
I was 5 years old in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and I was.
All right, I was 4 in Wallingford, Connecticut.
What was that?
I said that I was 4 in Wallingford, Connecticut.
Nice.
You're just up the road from me.
All right.
I don't remember last year. How does he remember when he was 5?
I have no memory of my life before first grade. I don't even. I do not know if I went to kindergarten. That's true. I have no earthly idea. I don't know. Brian, did they have kindergarten back then?
I don't think so. Not when I went to school.
I don't think I don't think I did. Which is probably why maybe me and you were warped, Brian. I don't know.
Oh, Gloria took down this amazing tree in our backyard, and we played on that sucker for months until it started to rot. When Dad had to clear it out, and we were upset. We were seriously upset with my father for several days because he took away our tree that we played on. I have these weird, that's just things that stick with you.
All right, hey, let's get the show started, because see, a lot of times we get the good stuff in the pre-show, we don't get it in the actual show. And Phil, are you okay there? Do you have any headphones? I mean,
I can hear you just fine. Do I sound okay?
Yeah, are you using an internal mic on your laptop?
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. No, we're good. I just want, and I'm not hearing any feedback. Sometimes we feedback through your mic, but I don't hear anything, so we're good.
Okay.
So
perfect.
So let's get this thing started. Let me get the recorders going here, because we are only 5 minutes late. And again, welcome to those of you watching on the television side. Here we go in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. This is WeatherBrains episode number 559 for October 3rd, 2016. This is James Spann. Thanks a lot for spending some time with us, and we're going to talk tropical weather this evening. It's going to be a good show. First off, let me introduce Kevin Selly, who is better known as the guy that tracks the trackers.
Thank you very much for that. Yes, just very excited for our guest tonight. A legendary. I figured out how he got on the show, though. I was looking through Phil's tweets earlier, and Bill does all the booking. So I see this tweet go by from Phil: tracks of Atlantic tropical cyclones since the Chicago Cubs last won the World Series. And
I love it.
Thought, oh, well, there's a baseball reference. Bang, he's on the show, because that's Bill's paying attention.
What's happening in Wichita Falls, Texas? Anything cool?
No, it's just been a delightful weekend, a little breezy, waiting on some thunderstorms tomorrow, and probably a little bit better chance on Thursday, but that's about it. It's quiet, the quiet before the fall, the autumn severe weather season.
Yeah, I saw we got an enhanced risk for parts of Kansas and Oklahoma on Wednesday, or tomorrow. I'm sorry, tomorrow the 4th of October. And where we are down here in the desert of the United States, Brian. We can't buy a raindrop.
Yes, I would pay money for a raindrop if I could get one right now, but the humidity levels are down. The good news is I think we said goodbye to the 90s, although we might verge on maybe 90 or 91. But
I mock you guys on your missing raindrops, because up until last year we were in a 5-year drought.
Okay.
And no offense, but the folks in Haiti are about to have about 30 inches more rain than they want. They'd be happy to send it to you.
I heard on some radio station today, too. They said, it looks like they're going to get 40 inches of rain.
That's not out of the question.
Yeah. I see where WPC was reporting or forecasting 30.
Yeah, and understand we had Hurricane Danny on the Gulf Coast here. I want to say it was 1997. And Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, you were working at the Weather Service back then. What, we have 36, 3 feet at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab with that?
Yes. Yeah, I was. Yeah. So it's not out of the question.
Right. So we're just saying that this kind of stuff can happen where you can get 3 feet or more of rain with a slow moving storm like this.
Do you think it would be possible for one hurricane to completely erode the entire island of Hispaniola?
Yeah. We'll talk about it. There's so much to talk about here. We're going to talk about current weather. And for those, again, that are listening a few weeks late or a few days late, just bear with us, because a lot of people are watching and listening live tonight because of Hurricane Matthew. Aubrey Urbanowitz has a pose like she's thinking about something.
I was bookmarking the that article that you were just sharing. Actually, I was putting it in my folder so I could go through and read it later.
Okay, the Rick Bragg article. Yeah, that's great.
It'll be in the show notes, by the way.
I've told Rick this. I said, Rick, goodness, if I could write like that, I write like a third grader. And I didn't take a single writing class in college. I might have taken one in high school. But I think what he has is a God-given gift. You can't learn what he has. He's a master storyteller. And there are so few left. And for those that didn't hear the pre-show, we're talking about Rick Bragg, who's a Pulitzer Prize winner. He's going into a Hall of Fame this week. And he wrote a piece about a tornado that hit a church, the Goshen United Methodist Church, on March 27th, 1994. It hit the church during Palm Sunday worship services, and 20 people died in the church. And he is originally from that part of the world. He was writing for the New York Times at the time, and it was just a stunning piece of writing. And Rick did a lot of writing after the generational outbreak 5 years ago here. And I'll never forget one of his lines in one of his pieces. It said, "A man with a chainsaw is worth 10 with a clipboard after a tornado." And how true is that?
Yeah.
But anyway, Aubrey is here. Good to have you. What's happening in the lovely Shenandoah Valley?
Pretty quiet, very quiet right now. It's been a nice weekend, nice start to our week, and awaiting the CAD setup as we head into the middle of the week, and then we'll see kind of what happens with Matthew.
Yeah, in fact, our guest is going to tell us. I'm so excited to have a tropical expert. In fact, right before the show started tonight, I spoke with the students in meteorology at Virginia Tech, and we had a great session electronically, obviously via Skype, and they said, what do you think Matthew's going to do? And the first thing I said, Nate, I said, tune into WeatherBrains at 9:30 because we have a guy that knows. So forget me. So if nobody else, we have the students at Virginia Tech watching. So Nate, bring in our guest.
All right. We are honored to have Dr. Phil Klotzbach, a research scientist with Colorado State University, on the program. You probably know him from his seasonal hurricane forecast that he's been doing for many, many years, including going back with Dr. William Gray, the now late Dr. William Gray. And we'll talk about his memories of working with Dr. Gray and just amazing fellow to be able to work with for so many years. But Dr. Klotzbach has really sort of stepped up into this role very much on his own, and has been tweeting out some just fantastic stuff over the last
best tropical tweeter in the universe.
There's been some really good stuff coming off your Twitter. I've been retweeting. I mean, just every now and again, you run across somebody you just want to put on an auto retweet, and
bingo.
One of those folks for the last little bit. So, Dr. Phil Klotzbach, we are happy to have you on the program. Thanks for joining us on WeatherBrains.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for retweeting my stuff. I work with tropical cyclone data a lot, so I figured, especially when there's storms out there, it's interesting to kind of try to put these things into historical perspective. And I think a lot of that does come from working with Dr. Gray for so long. Both as we talked about earlier about with the baseball thing too. Like if you're a stats guy, you like baseball and you like hurricanes.
And for those that are just now listening on the Purdue show, Phil, explain your tweet about hurricanes and the Chicago Cubs.
Well, first of all, as a caveat, I grew up in Boston, so I'm used to a very, very long drought without a World Series. Until 2004, us and the Cubs, we were kind of joined together. But
we stole your GM too.
What was that?
And we stole your GM too. Theo works for us now, and look at us.
I know, and look at you guys.
I'm not saying. I'm just saying.
He's a magic worker. No. But yeah, so I put it together last year, and I figured I'd update it this year, showing the tracks of all the tropical cyclones that have formed since the Chicago Cubs last won the World Series, which was back in 1908. But maybe this is their year. We'll see. They certainly look good all during the regular season.
Well, if it keeps Matthew offshore, I'd be happy to do whatever. Let's start off and let's talk a little bit about Matthew and some of the interesting tidbits. For one, over the weekend, this thing strengthened and went absolutely nuts south of Hispaniola and north of Colombia. Tell us a little bit about the context and how unusual it is for that to happen this late in the season.
Yeah, I mean, it's, the Eastern Caribbean is kind of notoriously known as the hurricane graveyard, and that's typically because you get a very strong, basically low-level jet that's basically driven by the landmass heating over South America. So that's the area where Matthew did its most rapid intensification was actually an area that typically you can get it there, like you had Hurricane Felix did a similar rapid intensification there, but it's unusual to get it there. But obviously Matthew did. It underwent it was the third highest rapid intensification over 24 hours, just behind Felix and Wilma. So very, very impressive strengthening. And I think the thing with Matthew that's made it so impressive is just it's been very, very slow moving. And typically we kind of know when tropical cyclones don't move, they upwell a lot of cold water, and then it basically kills themselves pretty quickly. But the Caribbean is an area that very deep, so you have a lot of basically have a lot of upper ocean heat content. So even though it's churning up water, you're still mixing in, even though you're churning up water, it's still very warm water. So a storm doesn't need to move as much as it does in a lot of other places. The only other area where you can see a similar type of thing in the Atlantic is near the Bahamas, which we saw last year with Hurricane Joaquin as well. Basically kind of went to the central Bahamas and just sat there for a couple of days and didn't weaken. And that's, again, because those areas are very deep, warm water. Dr. Gray always talked about storms in October kind of going into the Caribbean and cooking. Usually it's a little further west, like a Hurricane Wilma scenario, but this one certainly has been impressive. And it's been a very slow-moving, kind of plodding along methodically over the last few days, which is why it's been able to rack up a lot of these impressive statistics in the Eastern Caribbean. Again, it hasn't typically storms. You have the trade winds that push the storms along from east to west. So it's unusual to get a storm that kind of just sits there and doesn't really move from east to west. Just kind of basically wasn't gaining much in the way of longitude, or losing longitude, I should say.
And now that it's actually moving a little bit to the north, this slow movement could really mean bad news for folks, especially in Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's obviously a great concern. We were talking a little bit in the pre-show about the Weather Prediction Center is forecasting rainfall totals in Haiti over the mountainous terrain, potentially 20 to 30 inches. I remember back in 2004, Hurricane Jean made landfall in Dominican Republic and weakened to a tropical storm, and was mostly a tropical depression when it was over Haiti. But it killed about almost 3,000 people in Haiti due to the extensive flooding and mudslides. Most of the forests in Haiti have been removed because they use wood as their primary fuel source. So there's just really copious you get a lot of mudslides there. So that's obviously a great concern. And as you said, a very slow moving storm like Matthew is just going to drop very heavy amounts of rain over Haiti. So I think Haiti is certainly of great concern. It's interesting that it was 1963. So it was 53 years ago today that Hurricane Flora made landfall in Haiti as a Category 4. And that storm, 5,000 people died with Hurricane Flora. So hopefully we won't see a death toll like that, but certainly there's probably going to be some very significant humanitarian concerns over the next couple of days as the storm tracks, either making landfall over Haiti or tracking just to its west.
Phil, before we get too far into the forecast for Matthew, can you talk about what I consider to be amazing persistent thunderstorm activity complex on the eastern side for days?
Yeah, it's been really interesting, and there's been a lot of discussion of the quote-unquote blob. It almost looks kind of like an MCS that you would see, but
yes.
Go ahead.
No, I was just saying yes, and tell us why.
Yeah, well, I think there's going to be a lot more research done on this feature. It seems to me like a lot of it.
That's a nice polite way to say we just don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it is that you basically have a convergence zone between the westerly circulation around the tropical cyclone, and you have the easterly low-level trades because it's pretty far south. It's the lowest latitude Cat 5 that we've seen in the Atlantic. So it's deeper into the trade wind zone than you typically see with these storms. So I think there was some convergence associated with that may have helped support this blob. And also I think there were some terrain impacts as well. I mean, I think there was an article in Forbes magazine today that Marshall Shepard put out that kind of went into a little more detail describing some of the mechanisms that may have driven this particular kind of blob of convection. But like you said, it is remarkable just in how long it's persisted.
And isn't it just like stunning that one didn't draw or interrupt the other?
Yeah, I mean, it's really pretty remarkable. I'm really curious to see, in the next few months, some idealized modeling simulations, see if we can kind of simulate exactly what went on here. It is interesting how it kind of just stayed there. It didn't, like you said, it didn't seem to interrupt it, and the circulation didn't absorb it, or somehow it didn't just dissipate over time as it moved further north. You would have expected maybe it would dissipate, but I think it had something to do with the landmass interaction, but primarily probably just the convergence between the circulation around Matthew and then the low-level trades.
So Anthony Sagliani from WeatherBug just tweeted a couple of minutes ago, looking at some of the model analogs, and suggested that that Floyd may actually be a favored analog for this storm, given the setup. And really, the question is the the placement and the timing of the trough. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I was talking with Eric Blake at the Hurricane Center about that a little bit ago, and I think really your best analogs, given the latest forecasts, are probably Hurricane David in 1979, which basically kind of made landfall and skirted up the coast as a Category 1 and 2. And then we have, and then Hurricane Floyd in 1999, which Hurricane Floyd I certainly remember well. I mean, it was a very potent, I believe it was a Category 4 just to the east of Florida. And the models had a good forecast. It didn't hit Florida, but it was one of those things where you have this monstrous storm right offshore, and then went up and hit North Carolina and caused a huge amount of damage up there, mainly because due to flooding, inland flooding, and also it had been we had Hurricane Dennis a couple weeks earlier that had dropped a ton of rain, and then Floyd came in and dumped a bunch more rain, so we had a whole pile of flooding with Floyd. So inland flooding was the big one from that, but I think those two, both Floyd and David, are probably the most, at least in the last, say, 40 years, the tracks that at least, say, the GFS and the ECMW have kind of a forecast track pretty much skirting right up along the Florida coast. But I think one thing I think we need to do is, obviously it's a few days away, and it's going to be interacting with some topography over both Haiti and Cuba. So that may potentially, influence the strength of the vortex, and maybe potentially influence it, whether it wobbles a little bit or not. And I think really kind of how, this vortex interacts with, the ridge and the trough situation is going to impact exactly how this storm goes. One thing I will note is that one of the things Dr. Gray always talked about is if you're looking for East Coast landfalls, you want to see anomalous high pressure build over the Atlantic provinces of Canada. And you certainly, if you look at the anomalous forecast of the height fields over the Atlantic provinces, they are going to be pretty high. So that's kind of a telltale sign for at least a close call for the U.S. East Coast, which is what the models are predicting. So I think at this point, you can't say where the storm is going to go, but I think you can say that, definitely be prepared. My brother lives in Cocoa, Florida, right along the coast, and I've been telling him, to get ready.
Now, looks like we may have an invest that, if it were to develop, might be Nicole, little disturbance there, other side of Bermuda. How might that interact? Because I know over the weekend, the European, which was much more of an eastern outlier at the time of the model solutions, was actually having a little bit of interaction. It almost looked like this thing that might be Nicole at that point would actually flirt with Matthew and cause it to go farther east. Is that anything to that?
I mean, I think there's definitely the possibility. I'm trying to remember. I feel like even with Joaquin last year, there was some remnants of another storm or something that influenced it a little bit as well. So I'm not sure exactly. I haven't spent a ton of time looking at the latest model guidance, the ones that just came out. But yeah, I mean, I think this is certainly, another one of these cases where it's going to be very subtle differences in terms of whether the storm actually makes landfall or stays, just offshore. So certainly, obviously, a storm we're going to definitely be watching very, very closely coming up here in the next couple of days.
So the modeling on this has been interesting because for a time it looked like the European model was actually outperforming or performing no worse than the official Hurricane Center forecasts, and I'm not sure if that's still the case, but it certainly has been doing well. With the recent upgrades to the GFS, a lot of people asking, well, is this the European going to take over and win again, or is it flip-flopping? What's your sense on the model wars these days, and are we at a point where we can just write off one or the other? We just need to consolidate, or do we need to be paying attention to both?
No, I mean, I think you need to pay attention to all the different model guidance you have because, the European models had some pretty royal busts with Hermine. It had when it was by Hispaniola, it was forecasting a major hurricane going into various U.S. cities, windshield wipering along the way. So I think the models they have successes. Obviously, Joaquin last year, ECMWF did well as with Sandy in 2012, and obviously the European model in general. In terms of mid-latitude prediction, has the highest skill of any of the numerical models. But I think, when it comes to individual storms, individual events, there's a reason all these models are out there, and you want to take a look at all of them. And ECMWF hasn't been particularly consistent with what it's been forecasting with Matthew. It's been kind of going back and forth a bit. So I think it definitely, it you want to look at all the different models. And again, that's why the Hurricane Center guys do what they do. They're the best in the world. They know best how to kind of interpret all the different results and come out with the official forecast.
And if anything, the UK Met has been persistent about trying to bring this thing onshore, North Florida, and riding it upside the coastline through eastern Georgia, eastern South Carolina, and eastern North Carolina. And I wanted to write that off. As somebody who lives in North Carolina, I wanted to write that off. But it seems to have at least been right in this particular scenario. One of the things I want to get back to the analogs for a second, and one of the things that I guess the lesson that we learned from Floyd, not say that it hadn't been learned before, but maybe we were reminded of it, was the interaction between the tropical system coming onshore and interacting with an upper level feature like a trough, and how that helped to really accentuate the rainfall totals here, not only in North Carolina, but all the way up the eastern seaboard. Do we see that potential with Matthew? And can you talk a little bit about that?
I haven't looked extensively at that for this particular situation. So no, I guess I can't really say for sure on that one yet.
Gotcha. With regards to Matthew, anything else? Because I wanted to get on and sort of talk more about the seasonal forecasts and working with Dr. Gray. Anything else that sticks out at this point with you about Matthew?
I mean, I think, it's been a while. The Caribbean's been very quiet the last few years. We really haven't had much in there since about 2010. Since we had some really significant storms in the Caribbean. So we had Sandy come out of the Caribbean, but it didn't reach major hurricanes. We haven't really had much in the way of major hurricane activity at all the last few years. They've generally been pretty quiet. We had Joaquin last year, and Gonzalo in 2014. We had, Gaston out in the middle of nowhere, but the Caribbean's generally been pretty quiet the last few years. So it's really, it's interesting to kind of see that area pick back up. And again, I think, I do have a model that forecasts late season, October, November, hurricane activity in the Caribbean, and it came in very high this year. And I think basically the model has two predictors. It has your Eastern Pacific water temperatures, so whether you have El Nino, La Nina, and that was fairly cool, not quite La Nina, but cooler than normal. And then the water temperatures in the Caribbean, which are warmer than normal. And normally that doesn't necessarily mean a whole heck of a lot because the Caribbean's always really hot. But when it's warmer than normal late in the season, you kind of get an anomalous low pressure there, anomalous high pressure in the Eastern Pacific, and that basically helps to kind of generate kind of almost like a monsoon gyre type setup to help spin up tropical cyclones, help provide a little more like low level spin in that region. So that was certainly the case this year, and obviously Matthew has certainly been a quite the prolific storm so far, and unfortunately it looks like it's going to continue to be so.
Hey, Phil, we're not going to let you off the hook now before we move on to the questions here. So for those watching, we've got the Hurricane Center forecast track. They keep this thing a major hurricane just east of Daytona Beach, and then coming up as a Category 2 toward Cape Fear. What say you? Would you agree with this track from the Hurricane Center?
Yeah, I mean, you look at the model guidance, and that's pretty much, it looks to be a very, very close call for Florida. Up to the Carolinas and potentially even influencing New England later. So, I mean, I think definitely pretty much everyone along the East Coast needs to be prepared. Just before I went on the show, I just did a little math and added up. Right now, we have about 16 million people between Haiti, Cuba, Bahamas, and Turks and Caicos under hurricane watches or warnings. And I think that population is obviously going to be growing here potentially with some warrant watches, maybe even being issued for Florida.
Well, I'm sorry. NBC has told us 90 trillion are in the path, so you need to ratchet your numbers up. And again, you mentioned Floyd in 1999 as a possible analog. I was involved in that. I was in Jacksonville at the time. Our company owned a station there, and they evacuated parts of the coast there near Jacksonville, and really they wound up with no effect. And it's all about impact. We talk about this a lot in the weather business. It's about impact, not necessarily cones and lines and dots and things like that. What are your thoughts on the impact? Because a lot of people are watching this live and listening live. Our numbers are big right now. There are people in Miami and Daytona Beach and Jacksonville and Charleston asking impact. So just quickly summarize what you think might be the impact for those coastal cities from Miami all the way up to Cape Cod.
Well, I mean, it very much depends on the track of the storm. If the storm tracks a little further to the west and it actually comes on shore, it's obviously going to have a lot more significant impacts winds. If it stays just offshore, you're going to be it's a little bit more on the weaker side, but a lot depends on how the rainfall band's set up as well in terms of how much rain falls, and potentially on the storm surge. Obviously, if the storm were to go inland, you could certainly see some more significant impacts. I see you guys just put up a plot of the various track models. I mean, there's certainly my brother lives in Florida, my parents live in Massachusetts, and I have them both on alert for this particular storm. So, you know, I mean, I think it definitely, at this point, we can't say what the impacts are going to be, but they have the potential to be significant, pretty much anywhere from Miami all the way up the coast.
Let me ask you this. We talked about this with the meeting, and I'm sorry, Nate, I'll get back to you in a second. I'm curious on this one. There was a question brought up when I spoke to the kids at Virginia Tech, the students there. Twitter didn't exist when the last major hurricane came up and hit the United States. So we are in a learning mode now on how to handle information through social media. What do you post? What do you withhold? And, you know, obviously all this stuff is public. You might decide, well, I'm not going to show that, but the world is. Do you think it hurts or helps by these spaghetti plots being available to the world?
Well, I mean, maybe this one, I mean, this is a lot of models. I don't think I can tell you what every single model here is.
Oh, come on. We want you to list every one of them. There's about 30 of them there.
I mean, I think you have to realize things like the BAMS models and stuff. I mean, they're useful guidance tools, but they're not, you won't want to be using those, and things like Clipper. I mean, that's useful information, but it's not, a specific model forecast. And I see it like LBAR model as well. So, I mean, I think it's useful to, I think the general public necessarily seeing that isn't necessarily probably going to help them out a lot. I don't generally post too much model stuff, at least not beyond a few days. But I mean, like you said, it is all publicly available. I think it's tricky on a medium such as Twitter because you can only have about 160 characters or 140 characters to get your point across. So it's hard to do much explaining. Obviously, things on like if you're on TV or something, you can spend a little more time going into a little more explanation about what it is. But typically, I don't really get into the nuances of the tracks. I post more statistics and kind of try to put some of these things in the historical perspective.
Well, we got a lot of people posting model tracks right now, and James is one of them. But at the same time, there's value in doing it, I think. But the context is a lot of times what's missing, especially from folks that just look at it and go, "Ooh, spaghetti! Here's some tweets that are going to get a bunch of retweets." And providing the actual, not only the context from a meteorological standpoint, but also helping people understand what it is they need to do in the moment. Right now the guidance has been, from us, if you've got interests along the coast of North or South Carolina, you should know what your plan is, know what you're going to do, and be ready to execute that plan in the next couple of days if need be. And that, we may move to that stage tomorrow, but at this point, there's not really anything we can do other than just watch it and hope that it moves out to sea.
And Nate, I'd like to bring up a point here that yes, if the center of the storm is offshore, the impact is less. However, if it's not offshore very far, the coastal flooding is going to be phenomenal.
Yes.
So I don't want us to say that, there's a thin line there where if it's offshore, we're going to see nothing. And if it's onshore, we're going to see a lot. I think the closer to shore it is, even if it stays offshore, there's going to be a lot of coastal impacts with coastal flooding.
Without question. And we know, and this is, one of the things, when it went Cat 5 over the weekend, one of the things that got a lot of conversation was, we're just talking about the wind. And the wind is, wind does some damage. It's really the only thing that we can really wrap our heads around based on the tools that we have when it's out at sea. But in reality, the flooding kills more people, does more damage, et cetera, and that flooding can come in the form of both storm surge and inland rain flooding. So,
right.
And if you get it in a mountainous area, not only the rain, but you wind up getting into, downstream river flooding and that sort of thing. I remember in Floyd in '99, we had rivers that were still in flood weeks after Floyd came through here in 1999. So, and places that didn't really get a whole lot of damage from the hurricane itself still had issues later on. So, something for us to really keep in mind.
Well, and especially with some of the wave forecasts I've seen with Matthew of waves to 35 and 40 feet. Most of those are just offshore, and let's hope they stay there.
Yeah. So, Phil, let's talk a little bit about how the thing that I think most folks know you for, and that is the seasonal hurricane forecast. You sort of maybe teased us a little bit with your late season Caribbean activity, model, taking into account the Pacific temperatures and the Caribbean temperatures. But what was it exactly that got you into the seasonal forecasting in the first place?
Well, so I took I was an undergrad in college and took a climatology class, and I wanted to do a study on hurricanes. And my professor said, "Hey, you should look at this guy in Colorado. He predicts hurricanes on a seasonal level, so he uses climate." And I said, "You can't predict hurricanes in a season. I mean, come on, you can't predict weather 6 months in advance." So then I started taking a look and looked at his forecast and looked at the skill. Well, that's kind of what got me into it. And so I did a thesis as an undergraduate on seasonal forecasting, and then applied to go to grad school out at Colorado State. And he offered me a grad assistantship, and I was incredibly excited to work with Dr. Gray. Obviously, the man knows a tremendous amount about hurricanes. I wish he were still here. I'm sure I could see him. I can picture him right now running around with his 200 millibar Difax map, looking at the upper level pattern, trying to decide where the storm was going to go. That would be exactly what he would be doing, and I'm sure my fellow Gray project members would agree that was Dr. Gray. No matter how many nice try to color outputs he wanted, he always wanted the black and white Difax map with a 200 millibar flow. That's all he wanted to look at. So give me that, and I can forecast the world. So that was his tool. That was his favorite tool to use, and he did a good job with it.
A show titled, "Give Me That, and I Can Forecast the World."
Yeah,
that's right. Exactly.
Give me my
Oh man, you're teasing me with that image of Matthew. It's really mesmerizing.
It is. And some of the pictures that I've seen from the hurricane hunters that have been tweeting and posting on Facebook from in the flights and in the eye are just incredible. And it's just really just this strange irony that one of the most dangerous storms to roam the earth can also be produce some of the most beautiful sights in terms of cloud formations and things like that.
Well, I think there's also a pretty impressive looking super typhoon in the Northwest Pacific as well. We've had a few in the West Pacific, but overall it hasn't been like last year. We had a lot more Cat 4s and 5s in this year, but this right now we actually do have a super typhoon Chaba in the Northwest Pacific, and that looks pretty amazing on satellite imagery as well. So if you want to look at a different amazing looking tropical cyclone, I'd suggest taking out super typhoon Chaba. It's potentially gonna have some impacts in Japan down the road.
Yep. So one of the things I like about reading, and if you haven't, a lot of folks get the News Digest. Here's what the Dr. Klotzbach's team is predicting in terms of hurricanes this season. But the reports are fascinating because you guys and Dr. Gray before you make your predictions, you lay it all out there, and then at the end of the season, you rip your prediction to shreds. And if it's good, here's why. Here's what worked. Here's what didn't. Tell me about that and that sort of the role that brutal honesty in terms of verifying your forecast plays in the learning process. Because when I talk to school kids and everything else, one of the things I tell them is that if you stop at the forecast, you're only doing half the work. That you need to go back after it's over, especially with big events, and try and understand what part of your forecast process worked and what didn't. Tell us a little bit about the role that plays in the seasonal forecasting, especially since it's sort of a new horizon in our science.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to verify your forecasts. And we have on our website, we have all of our forecasts back to 84 scanned in. If you want to see what Dr. Gray was using back in, say, like 1987, we have all of our forecasts, the numbers, as well as the actual documents. But I think it's really important to verify what you predict. Because obviously you learn a lot when you bust. It's nice to have a perfect forecast every time. That's not the way it works. And if you don't have a good forecast, it's good to go back and look and try to see, what didn't transpire the way that we thought it would. And I think that's what we try to do. I try to kind of grab quotes from various of the forecasts that I put out and say, okay, what worked, what didn't work. And then try to learn from it. And if you have to tune the models. But there are some years where, there's certain years where you have a really hard time forecasting, and it's not necessarily you should just trash your model because it doesn't work well in 1 year. Using a statistical model, it's going to have some times where it maybe isn't necessarily perfect. So you don't want to necessarily throw away your model. And you don't try to get necessarily too discouraged. While certainly everyone wants to have a perfect forecast, if you have one bad forecast, don't necessarily quit or give up. I mean, you learn a lot in this business, and I think as you go along and do it, and Dr. Gray been doing it for over 30 years, you kind of start to pick up on things, and hopefully the idea that I always say is, and at the end of the day, I will make another forecast bust in my life, but my goal is not to bust for the same reason I busted the last time. At least it's something else that gets me. It's not the same thing twice.
Yep. What sorts of lessons have you learned in the last few years in terms of improving the forecast model that you use to generate the seasonal numbers?
Yeah, so we use a variety of techniques. I have a statistical model. So I basically go in and select parameters that work well at forecasting historical hurricanes in the past. So things like El Nino, the water temperatures in the tropical Pacific is one of the ones Dr. Gray used originally in '84 and we still use to this day. Things like Atlantic water temperatures, pressures. As you get into the early part of the season, the low level wind flow, especially in the Caribbean, is a very important predictor. So we use a lot of that, and as the dynamical models have gotten better, I've been starting to incorporate some of their forecasts of things like shears and pressures as well. So the numerical models will forecast, say, what the pressures are going to be during the hurricane season, and if they're lower than normal, that tends to be overall just in a more unstable environment, a more conducive environment for storms to form and to intensify. So we use some more of the dynamical model guidance, and I'll probably use more and more of that as time goes along, as those models get better. Numerical models predicting seasonal hurricane activity. There are some that do, and I put together a website with a group from Barcelona, the Barcelona Supercomputing Center, where we have all of the seasonal forecasts that are put out by all the various agencies archived in one place, so you can compare and see kind of who's doing best on a particular year versus everyone else. So that's something, if you're interested in seasonal forecasts, not just from CSU. We have, I think, 15 or 16 groups contributing right now, and hopefully, I'm guessing that number will grow a little bit next year.
In terms of the forecast, what role do you think those should play? I mean, obviously, you're doing the forecast to try and advance the science and to try and understand, how the atmosphere works on a sort of a seasonal timescale. What do you think the general public should be doing with these numbers? Or because I'm sure back in 1984, Dr. Cray wasn't going out and saying, calling up every television station and saying, I got this seasonal forecast. You should air, for the next 3 days. What should folks at home do with those numbers at the beginning of the season and when it's updated a couple of times through the year?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea is that we put it out as kind of an informational tool. People are curious, how active is the season going to be? But it's an informational tool only. It's not a preparedness tool. We don't say, oh, it's an inact, because at the end of the day, most parts of the U.S. coastline, no matter how active the season, aren't going to be impacted. But obviously, it only takes out one storm to make it a very active season for you. I mean, this year, up until Matthew, had been pretty quiet. We had about the overall activity was about 2/3 of normal through the end of September. And obviously, when you have a storm like Matthew, that can make up those numbers in a really short amount of time. So I think that's something that we try to emphasize with our seasonal forecast, is that it's a useful kind of informational tool. And we, at Dr. Gray, one of the things he was happiest is what people started to learn things like, hey, when you have El Nino, that tends to mean a quieter hurricane season. People kind of know that now, which obviously before he started putting those out, nobody did. And I think another thing too is by forecasting these storms every year, you learn a lot. You probably learn more than you would if you weren't putting out these forecasts. By kind of sticking your neck out there and then verifying at the end, you figure out what the heck happened. Why didn't we forecast this correctly, or why did this forecast work out? And for example, a year like 2013, where we busted really badly, you learn a lot by going back and trying to figure out exactly what happened. Why wasn't the season as active as we thought? This year, the seasonal forecast is probably going to end up working out fairly close to being correct, unless we get some other crazy storm later in the season. But it's certainly been an interesting year. Again, we were running pretty quiet until Matthew came along, and this will be the third year in a row that we're going to have more overall accumulated cyclone energy in October than we have in September, which is unusual. Usually September is by far the peak month of the season.
So that begs the question. Dr. Gray was known for his view on climate change. He was,
you knew that was coming.
Oh yeah, tell us a little about the role that a changing climate, would have in theory on the hurricane season, and what sorts of things that you and your team have noticed over the time that you've been looking at this, in terms of shifts, maybe, in the signal of when hurricanes are more likely to happen and where.
Yeah, so I've done quite a bit looking, especially I've done a lot looking at global tropical cyclone activity. There were some papers that came out about 10 years ago saying that category 4s and 5s had doubled and all these storms are going nuts. And then we've generally been running fairly quiet the last few years in the Atlantic. And if you look at, the tricky thing is when you look at global tropical cyclone data, we can't go back very far before you have significant underestimates. So in the Atlantic, we have the luxury of aircraft reconnaissance. We fly planes in the storms. So we generally have a pretty good idea, especially when they get close to but if you go to other basins, all we have been doing is estimating these things from satellites. We had Western Pacific had aircraft until '87, but then they stopped flying it. So you're estimating storm intensities from satellites. And as you go back in time and look at storms on satellite imagery, they look less and less impressive just because the resolution of the imagery has been degraded. So as you go back in time, you just have significant underestimate issues that get involved. So we've looked at trends over the last 30 years, and we've had pretty good satellite imagery. And we have had generally consistent ways of estimating the intensities of the storms from the satellites. And when you look at it over the last 30 years, we really haven't seen much of a trend. And this year, actually, right now, I keep track of global storms in real time. And for the Northern Hemisphere, accumulated cyclone energy right now is pretty much exactly dead on normal. Typically in El Nino years, you get a lot more activity globally because while the Atlantic goes up, most of the rest of the world goes down. And I'm sorry, in El Nino years, the Atlantic goes down, and most of the rest of the world goes up. So El Nino years tend to be the more active globally, and La Niñas tend to be a lot quieter globally, even though the Atlantic goes up.
Let's talk a little bit about working with Dr. Gray. You mentioned that you signed on, early for a master's degree and stayed on there, finished out your PhD. Tell us about, of course, we lost Dr. Gray within the last year. Tell us about working with him and some of the lessons that he taught you about. You've you woven some of those into the conversation already, which is great. I'm going to go back and listen and write all this stuff down. But tell us about working with the man, and obviously you're a big baseball fan, big tropical weather fan. Tell us about the man.
Yeah, Dr. Gray he was an incredible human being. I mean, he was like, I don't think anybody met Dr. Gray and didn't come up. If you met him, you remembered him. He wasn't the kind of person who everybody I know who met Dr. Gray they have a Bill Gray story. No one, he just made that kind of an impression. He was about 6'5", and he was very loud. So he always knew when I'd turn my volume down whenever I would talk to him. If you'd call me on the phone. But yeah, no, he was a great guy. He was a huge baseball fan. He actually pitched in college, and he injured his knee. He's about 21 years old, and he injured his knee, so that kind of curtailed his pitching career. And then he was into the Air Force, and he went out to the University of Chicago after his time in the Air Force and studied under Herbert Reel, who was kind of one of the biggest hurricane researchers in the 50s. And then he and Herbert Reel came out. Reel came out to start the department at Colorado State, and Dr. Gray came out with him in the early 1960s. And Dr. Gray never threw anything out. So when we went through his office, we found the original offer letter that Herbert Reel wrote to Dr. Gray offering him the job at CSU. The man never threw anything out. It was amazing.
I remember seeing some of your tweets and social media updates about that when you guys were starting to clean out his office, and some of just the weather history gold that you found.
Oh my gosh! Like he had the preprint of the first the first ever AMS tropical medium, like 1962, I think, or 61, something like that. And he was really mad because he didn't get to go to the second one. He went to like 30 in a row, and he didn't go to the second one because he said Herbert Reel was too cheap to send him. he was not a happy camper about missing the second one. But Dr. Gray, one of the things he always said was, he'd stop working when they put him in a box. And I can tell you, I was talking with him a couple days before he died, and he was still trying to get stuff done. And I put out the seasonal forecast, and I got his input. The April forecast, he passed away like a couple days after it went out, and he was still talking with me about the forecast a couple days ahead of time. So I'm sure if he were around right now, he'd be jumping up and down talking about Matthew, and he'd be very, very excited. He always got fired up when hurricanes were around.
Obviously, you mentioned he liked his 200 millibar Difax charts, but what other sorts of forecasting techniques did he have that still have a lot of value today?
Well, I mean, he was always kind of an analog man. He always liked to look and see, okay, we've seen this in the past, because he came up in an era where you didn't have numerical models. They were really in their infancy, or really were kind of useless. In like the 50s, they started to have them, but they didn't. A good forecaster could beat them in terms of skill. So he kind of grew up in that environment. So he was used to kind of single station analysis and things like forecasting the weather 1 or 2 days out based on one station's information. So he was he was a really, really good forecaster. He spent several years forecasting in the Azores and the Air Force. So he had an intuitive grasp of the way that the atmosphere and the ocean ticked. And I think that's kind of what set him apart from a lot of other people, is he just had kind of an intuitive way of kind of knowing how the storms were going to, how things are going to behave. It wasn't like it was a perfect forecast, but he had some intuition that a lot of people don't have unless he liked the Tephigram. He wasn't a QT man. He always wanted to use the Tephigram. But I would always see him, like, I'd go visit him at his house, and he'd be in his lawn chair sitting back and have a Tephigram and drawing up, plotting sounding. So he was a character. He was a unique individual. I could tell Bill Gray stories for several hours, but probably want to move on from that. But he also I can't diverge without telling you one of his traditions that he always did, and that was the every day on seasonal forecast day he brought in donuts. He was a very big aficionado of donuts, and that's one thing I've definitely kept alive, is his consumption of donuts.
What kind of donuts? Jelly donuts, powdered donuts, glazed donuts, Dunkin', Krispy Kreme? What are we talking about here?
He was a plain glazed kind of guy. He had tried a lot of very gourmet food over the years, and with all his travel that he did, he was certainly not a foodie. We'll leave it at that.
There's nothing wrong with not being a foodie. Foodie maybe.
Well, we'll just say when I go to his refrigerator, I have to go and clean out expired food, and he'd be yelling at me, telling me he was going to eat it. And I was like, no, I won't let you eat that. That's got stuff growing on
it. Oh man, reminds me of when we went to go after my great grandmother passed away back in '95, I guess, 95, 96, no, 94, 95. We went to go clean out her house. And there was stuff, honest to God, in the mid-90s, we threw out stuff that expired during the Eisenhower administration. So I get this sense, although my great-grandmother wasn't collecting preprints from the first AMS tropical meteorology meeting. So she was collecting stuff, but I'm not sure of the value of most of it.
Well, there was a lot of stuff in Dr. Gray's office that there were a lot of recycle bins filled up as well, but there was certainly some very interesting material in there amongst the less interesting. But yeah, he was a great guy to work for, and I'll just try to continue his legacy as best I can. I will say that before you go into that,
I wanted to ask you about all of the stuff you cleaned out of his office. Is that in your office now? Is it going to be a library exhibit?
So there's actually the archives. CSU archives took a lot of it. So a lot of it's going to be archived. I scanned a few of the things that I thought were exceptionally cool, but I was hoping there might be some really cool satellite imagery that he had that no one else had, or aircraft recon data. But an interesting story that I do have is that Dr. Gray started the seasonal forecast in '84, but before '84, he was an aircraft recon guy. Dr. Gray would take large amounts of data and synthesize it and come up with theories as to how hurricanes basically formed, why their structure and intensity. He had been studying hurricanes for almost 30 years before he started doing the seasonal forecast. And so in the early 1980s, he had gotten a whole bunch more aircraft recon data, and he was going to work on it. And one of his students left the recon data next to the trash can. And so the custodian actually ended up throwing it away, and they couldn't find it.
Oh,
and so
no.
that was going to be his next several years of material. And when he lost that, one of the things he went and started dinking around with was a seasonal forecast. So if his graduate student hadn't thrown away all that aircraft recon data, maybe Dr. Gray would never have done the seasonal forecast. So you never know.
And to be clear, that particular grad student wasn't you. You weren't there yet.
Oh no, this is in 1982 or 83. No, I was. It was before I wasn't interested in hurricanes quite yet.
Yeah. So what do you think his legacy is in terms of, I mean, obviously the seasonal forecast, the thing he's most known for, is that his legacy? Is there something more to that?
Well, to me, I think really his biggest legacy in terms of his contribution to the field is he was the one who basically came up with why storms form where they do around the globe. He was the first one to do a global tropical cyclone climatology in 1968, where he basically went and showed here's why storms form where they do, and they have what's called these genesis parameters, which are basically things that storms need to form. So basically you need to have water temperatures above about 26 degrees Celsius, you need high levels of mid-level moisture, you can't form right on the equator, you don't want too much vertical shear, all these things, even things like vertical wind shear wasn't really well understood, that you didn't want a lot of it near the center of the storm. That was something that really wasn't well understood until Dr. Gray kind of calculated all that. So I think that, to me, is one of his biggest contributions, was that global tropical cyclone climatology. And I'm actually working right now with a few colleagues who are doing a kind of revisitation of Dr. Gray's early global tropical cyclone climatologies that we're hopefully going to be submitting for publication in a couple of weeks. So we're going to be doing that. And then we got permission to do a paper for the bulletin of the AMS, where we're going to kind of look at the various aspects that Dr. Gray, because he not only did seasonal forecasting, he did structure of storms, intensity change of storms, and he did a lot with tropical convection, not even hurricane related, just why basically that your peak of oceanic convection in the tropics is during the early morning hours, things like that weren't noted. So he had massive contributions in a lot of areas. So we're doing a BAMS paper kind of on his contributions and then kind of how those fields have grown since what he started. So we're going to try to do a couple of papers to make sure that his legacy is not forgotten. And I will continue to tweet things about Dr. Gray as often as I can, because I just he was a great guy. And I was very very fortunate to get a chance to work with him for about 16 years.
Hey, Phil, let me ask you this. You've been doing the seasonal outlooks for a long time. Now it seems like everybody does them. NOAA's in the business. You've got the private people like AccuWeather, Kim Kardashian. Everybody's got a tropical outlook, seasonal outlook. Does that bother you that they kind of copied your product?
No, I mean, I think, it's good. And that's one of the reasons why we created this website, to kind of list all the different forecasts so people can kind of see who's out there. Honestly, even in the putting together that website, there were a few groups that myself and the colleague that I was working with from Barcelona, we didn't know did these seasonal forecasts. And when we started looking, there were a couple of the universities that we didn't know were doing it. I think a lot of it is, a lot of the groups are using very similar predictors to what, Dr. Gray started out of CSU. There isn't a ton of, the numerical models. I mean, that kind of stuff was in its infancy when Dr. Gray was starting these forecasts. So I think, for me, I think it's always good to have a statistical forecast that's being issued, because that's, especially even if numerical models say get really good and can start doing really good seasonal forecasts, it's still good to have statistical models as a baseline for skill, because if you can't beat a stats model, then, I think it's good to have the stats models as a baseline. I think one thing that we do more than a lot of the other groups is we put out a pretty extensive forecast document. Nate already mentioned the verification, which is 40, 50, 60 pages long. Now Dr. Gray has passed away. It'll probably shrink a little bit. I cut down a little bit on the verbiage, but we do extensive verifications. And when we do the forecast, we put out extensive documents kind of describing what we see. Because I think for doing the verification at the end of the year, it's important to know basically why we forecast what we did. And I want to look back and see, okay, why was I thinking that? Why did I forecast an active season and we had 4 storms? It's good to kind of look back and see what you were thinking, because over the course of the year, you kind of forget maybe what your thoughts were, why you forecast what you did. And one other thing I do is we keep track. Our website recently got redesigned. The university did a good redesign of the forecast website. And on there, I also keep track of global statistics in real time. So if you want to see kind of how this year compares with normal in the Atlantic or globally, I have the statistics for global storms. So if you're interested in kind of a global view of overall storm activity around the globe, you can check out that website.
And let me ask you this. You touched on this earlier. Let's say I'm an emergency manager in Galveston or in West Palm Beach. What do I do with your seasonal outlook? What action, if any, should be taken by an emergency manager or somebody like that based on a seasonal outlook?
Well, I mean, I think what we found, I think Neil Frank, the former director of the Hurricane Center, used to say this with Dr. Gray with the forecast is, it's not a matter of you want to use the forecast as, the forecast active season, you need to be more prepared. But seasonal forecast gets in the news, and then you can use that as a hook to basically say, okay, if they're predicting an inactive season, you can say, yes, but, if you're in Galveston, you can say, yes, but the quietest season in the last 50 years was 1983, and Hurricane Alicia went in and did a huge amount of damage in our area. Or if you're in Florida, you can say Hurricane Andrew. Or if it's an active season, you don't necessarily need as much of a hook to get people ready. But I think that's kind of what it did, is it kind of reminds people that hurricane season's coming up. Again, to me, it's a satisfying the curiosity of the general public. They want to know, what the season's going to be like. But we always emphasize that, this isn't a preparedness tool. You're not supposed to, take more or less action based on this. It's more just an informational tool, just to give people an idea of what we're looking at.
And I'll ask the big question nobody else likes to ask. So the 800-pound gorilla with Dr. Gray is the climate change issue. And he was demonized by a lot of people in the weather enterprise. And it's sad to me that that's the litmus test. You have to believe this or believe this. But how did that affect him toward the end of his career, that whole publicity he got surrounding that issue?
Yeah, well, Dr. Gray definitely believed very strongly about climate change. And he was always trying to get me to get more fired up about it than I think he couldn't understand that everyone wasn't necessarily as fired up as he was. But, for Dr. Gray, whether he was right or wrong, I mean, those were his views, and he very strongly believed them. And in terms of his retirement years, or not his retirement years, but his, later years, it would have been a lot easier for him if he had just kind of either said nothing or kind of gone along with the flow. By being a very vocal skeptic of climate change, certainly made it harder for him than it otherwise would have. He probably missed out on some awards, and otherwise he probably could have just kind of feed it out into the sunset. But by making the stance that he did, it certainly it certainly raised some challenges for him in terms of getting funding for our research, and just in terms of interactions with people. He was Dr. Gray loved to argue, and he liked to argue, and I think that was his way of learning. He said he always felt like a good argument was a way to learn, and I don't mind a good argument. So he and I would go at it, and we argued, and we'd be yelling, but we'd be agreeing. That was just his way. But I think some people don't necessarily like to argue, and he always wanted argument. So if you didn't like that kind of confrontational, argumentative style, I think it could have rubbed people the wrong way. And there was a lot of nastiness around 2005, 2006 with the whole hurricanes and climate change thing. But I think at the end of the day, his views on the hurricanes and climate change thing have certainly been proven correct, given the last 10 years that we've seen, these category 4s and 5s, you get them, but they haven't doubled like some of those earlier papers said. The data in the 70s and early 80s just wasn't really very good. We underestimated or just missed a lot of storms, especially in areas like the Southern Hemisphere. And even in Northeast Pacific, the data in the 70s isn't necessarily very good.
Phil, I have a request for you, if you're willing, as you're going around writing all these papers and doing things, and especially when you do shows like this or you speak to people, if you'll have a little notepad with you, and every time you say, Dr. Gray used to say, I want you to write that down and make a book. Because you said that early on in this program, and I was scrambling for a piece of it. I've got to remember this because it's a nice little tip.
I think this is a great idea. This is like life's little instruction book. It's one of these little Hallmark things you'd sell out.
Yes, there's your show title, Life's Little Hurricane Book.
Exactly.
Well, if you got Chris Lancy and Eric Blake on the show too, we could have an hour-long session just what stuff Dr. Gray used to say.
So Phil, one last question, and then we'll let you go. Or you are certainly welcome to hang out for the rest of the show. But to wrap up the interview part, we spent a lot of time talking about Dr. Gray and his legacy. You have, in a lot of ways, ascended the throne of the kingdom that he built. What do you want your legacy to be with this, and how long do you plan on doing it? Is this you plan on doing this as a lifelong passion, or you have other things that you're interested in doing?
And what do you want to see?
Oh, go ahead.
Well, just to extend Nate's question, what do you want to see happen? What do you want? You want new satellites? What do you want as we go forward?
I want a better knowledge of what happened in 1903. No, I mean, the more historical data that I have, the better. So I'm very excited when these historical reanalysis products come out. The European Center is in the process of doing a full 4-dimensional data assimilation assessment of everything since 1900, and they took a bunch of old pieballs and old weather balloons, and are going to try to do a little bit of estimate of what the upper air was like in the 30s and 40s. So the more historical data that I have to build my statistical models off of, the better. So I'm excited to at least give it a look. Obviously, you can't know exactly what things were going on in 1910 or whatever, but any improvement on the realizations of what was going on definitely helps me out. But in terms of the seasonal forecast, I intend to keep that going as long as I can. Dr. Gray made me promise I'd give him 50 more years of seasonal forecasts. I told him, I said, hey, you did it for 30. I only need to do it for 60. So, but yeah, no, I mean, I enjoy doing the seasonal forecast. I think it's a good exercise. It definitely, it's a challenge every year. And I think in terms of other interests, I mean, I'm interested a lot in global tropical cyclones. My interests are more than just the Atlantic. And obviously, I've fascinated with nor'easters. I wrote a paper on nor'easters the nor'easters of early 2015 and some tropical connections with those. So every now and then I do venture outside the tropics.
How many hours do you put into the seasonal forecast? Did you answer that already?
I haven't. No, I mean, the hard thing is I'm looking at it all the time. So it's not like I suddenly say, okay, this week I'm working on the seasonal forecast. I mean, it's one of those things where I'm looking at stuff all the time. So it's not like, it's really hard for me to say exactly how many hours I do because I'm looking at this stuff, day in and day out. So I probably say about 2 weeks. 1 to 2 weeks is when I really focus on the forecast. But then prior to that, I'm always looking at stuff. I don't come in, March 15th cold for the April 1 forecast. I kind of already have a rough idea maybe what I'd be looking at.
Hey, so Phil, we're gonna let you go. I know you're very busy with Matthew going on here, but first off, plug anything you want to plug. Twitter feed, website, go.
Well, yeah, if you're interested in geeky hurricane stash, you can follow me on Twitter at Phil Klotzbach. I'm the only Phil Klotzbach, best I know, on Twitter. So if you find another one, definitely let me know because I'm sure we're related. We do have a seasonal forecast website. That's tropical.coloradostate.edu. And off of that, you can get access to a whole pile of stuff. But again, if you just Google Phil Klotzbach, you'll find that very easily. And then we have, like I mentioned, we do have a website. It's called seasonalhurricanepredictions.org. And that is all of the seasonal forecasts that we know of for the Atlantic Basin that are put out by either government agencies, universities, or private weather forecasting companies. And we're hoping to make that go global in the next year or two. So there's limited numbers for other basins, but we are going to try to incorporate that in the next couple of years.
Awesome. And if you can, stick around. We got about 15 more minutes. If you got to go, we totally understand that because you're busy. So, but again, thanks for being on the show. And I see Aubrey is here. Aubrey, since I'm seeing you here, I do believe that we probably should right now roll that email song because you just might have a little email.
Letters. We get letters. We get stacks and stacks of letters.
Yes, we do have a few letters. Let's see. So this one comes in. This is a guest suggestion for a couple people. A really cool email came in from Ira Schaefer. So thank you, Ira, for sending these in. Ira is a huge fan and also an alum of the Penn State Certificate of Achievement in Weather Forecasting program. Basically, it's an online program of 12 credits that teaches meteorology to hobbyist storm chasers or other professionals who rely on some weather data. I did not know this program existed. This is actually pretty cool. So he thinks a great guest for us would be Dr. David Babb or Dr. Steve Simon, the two guys that run the program for PSU. So he's got some contact information. And that would be really interesting. So thank you for sending that in, Ira. Nate, are you going to be talking about the emergency text alerts that are getting upgraded?
Or if you want to, that's fine. Either way.
I did not look at the details, but I just noticed that Daniel.
Daniel Lucas sent us that link, and he's actually a fantastic source for us in terms of great news stories. Coming up, we're going to see the WEA or wireless emergency alerts changing here in the next little bit, and those will allow them to actually send links to more information and things like that. So as well as expanding the amount of text that they can send on those. So that's certainly good news. If the severe storm for your location, check local media isn't enough information for you, we'll be able to send you some more good stuff.
It seems like a lot of, because our is the FCC just kind of changing how those alerts go out? Because I know like our station alerts are changing and
That
stuff.
I don't know.
I'm just curious. All right. So thank you, Daniel, for sending that in along with your other great emails that you send in. Jim Walker sent us just a funny little weather story. So thank you for sending that in. And I think that's it. We talked about the listener survey response. That's all I've got. So if you have an email for us, just email us, email@weatherbrains.com. You can also find us on the Twitter and the Facebook. And we appreciate all of your emails, all of your notes, guest suggestions, what you like, what you don't like about the show. And we appreciate you contacting us and listening.
Awesome. And we are going to take a pause here for WeatherBrains 101, the Astronomy Report with Tony Rice. We'll come back with a weather roundup, picks of the week, and much more as WeatherBrains rolls along.
WeatherBrains 101 with Professor Peters.
Did you know that there is a weather satellite orbiting the Earth 1 million miles away? That's right. In July 2016, data from NOAA's first deep space weather satellite orbiting 1 million miles away between the Earth and the Sun began making its way into the hands of forecasters at NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center, the nation's official source of space weather alerts and warnings. Space weather fortunately poses little direct risk to people, but it can affect our activities by disrupting power grids, aviation, telecommunications, and GPS systems. The new satellite, called Discover, that's DSCOVR, which stands for Deep Space Climate Observing Laboratory, is now in operation and serves as America's primary warning system when solar activity is detected. When there is an eruption on the sun, high-velocity solar wind and plasma are released into the solar system. Discover's sensors measure the speed, density, and temperature of the solar wind, and the strength and direction of the strong magnetic field as storms approach Earth, providing space weather forecasters information with which to issue critical space weather warnings and alerts. The aurora borealis, or more commonly known as the northern lights, are the result of space weather interacting with Earth's atmosphere. NOAA scientists will not only use Discover data to monitor space weather for potentially harmful geomagnetic storms, but they will also use data to provide forecasts on where you might see the spectacular red, purple, and green curtain-like lights of an aurora. Later this year, Discover data will be used in a new forecast model, the Geospace model, which for the first time will provide businesses, communities, and emergency managers with critical regional data when a space weather threat is imminent. A solar storm, for instance, may bring a higher danger to one region of the world, but not another, making this more localized short-term forecast an important decision-making tool. NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center has been issuing a single forecast for the entire planet. The Geospace model will provide a global map showing the intensity of predicted space weather impacts by latitude, longitude, and time. So who says the gang at WeatherBrains doesn't go far out to bring you the latest news from the world of weather? If you have a weather question, drop an email to question@weatherbrains.com.
Looking beyond the atmosphere, here's Tony Rice with your Astronomy Outlook.
Look to the west after sunset this week to spot Venus. It's very bright and will be near the waxing crescent moon the beginning of this week. Venus will be visible about 10 to 15 degrees above the horizon throughout October, shortly after sunset. The show culminates on the 27th when Venus, the star Antares, and Saturn all line up vertically. Orbital ATK has set Sunday, October 9th at 10:47 p.m. Eastern as launch time for their improved Antares rocket. The OA-5 will lead the Cygnus spacecraft on a resupply mission to the International Space Station. If Hurricane Matthew holds out and the skies are clear, this night launch has the potential to be visible. You'll see a flickering light rising in the sky as the Antares travels southeast on a path to catch up with the station. Nearly 2 years ago, an Antares flight was terminated 15 seconds after liftoff when it began losing thrust and falling back to the pad. The problem was pinpointed, and the Soviet-era AJ-26 engines were replaced by newer Russian-built RD-181 engines. Sunday's planned launch is the return to flight for Antares. That launch date could change, however. All eyes are on Hurricane Matthew. Even if postponed, more night launch opportunities are available. Launch windows of the ISS are based on when the space station passes over the launch site. The station takes about 90 minutes to orbit the Earth, while the Earth continues to rotate beneath. So, each day's delay puts the launch window about 90 minutes earlier in the day. Launch windows for OA5 through 2 on the 12th and the 13th will be before sunset, but launch still Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas. _Wallops or my Twitter feed at RTPHokey for the latest on this launch.
When the weather all is red, farm when the weather green, no change in the weather is foreseen when colors blink by night or day. Precipitation's on the way.
Well, I think we've done our weather roundup. We've talked about Matthew. That's obviously the big deal. Nate, what say you on Matthew? I asked Phil, and he said he's riding with the Hurricane Center. What say you?
I know it's going to ruin my weekend no matter what, and that's the least of the global concerns. I really am fearful for the folks in Haiti tonight, tomorrow. That's going to be just bad. There's really no other way around that. Folks in the Bahamas.
Yeah, people say, well, it's not a 5. Well, so what? The impact's going to be the same. I mean, if it's a 3, if it's a 4, it's a 5 for Haiti. I think the impact is going to be the same. And you're right, Nate, that this could be a humanitarian crisis there, and probably will be. And understand it's going to come right up through the Bahamas, and it's not going to be that different in terms of structure and the ability to cause havoc, and that's going to be a big problem. So you've got Haiti and eastern Cuba and the Bahamas, and then you and our pals in North Carolina will have fun watching this. It's going to be a close call.
Yeah, the early cycle models here heading into this evening are not good. The shift has been on for the last couple of cycles now, with more of them bringing the center onshore in far eastern North Carolina or along the Outer Banks. And as we mentioned, even if it stays offshore, and even with it, it's the center of the area of maximum winds is really small with this. I mean, it's a big storm in terms of the breadth of the cloud cover, the central disk overcast, and how much rain. But in terms of the wind field, it's actually fairly compact right now. But the farther north it gets, there are indications that it would likely expand. And certainly as it begins to shift to a more post-tropical storm, we get that expansion of the wind field. So, even here inland, as far west as Raleigh, even if it stays offshore, we could still have some impacts here in town. So it's something we're watching, obviously, in very, very closely here in North Carolina. We had Hermine come through, and that was for the most part a non-event. I mean, it was Friday night we had some rain and a little bit of flooding, and there were some areas along the Outer Banks that had some more significant flooding, but in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't that big of a deal for a lot of people. But in this case, this has the potential to be a very big deal for a lot of people, even if the center never actually makes landfall in the United States. So we're watching it very closely. Kevin?
Yeah, that angle of approach, too, even if it just scrapes along the coast, is devastating for not only the Outer Banks, but the other side, the western side of the Sounds, too.
Yeah, and there's a lot of Charlie sort of approach here with the very acute angle to the approach to the coastline that could sort of skim the coastline. And one of the first things you learn in weather school is that concave coastlines are good places for areas of low pressure. So we could wind up seeing that that helping to enhance its strength as it just past the Bahamas and up north past Georgia and South Carolina. So we're obviously watching it incredibly closely here along the coast of North Carolina. Ideally for us, once it gets past the Bahamas, it would sort of hang a bit of a right and split the uprights between Hatteras and Bermuda. That would be ideal. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like that is likely at this point.
And then this is the last thing to be concerned about, but do you have any home football games up there.
We
in that
do.
part of the world this
NC
Saturday.
State and Carolina both have home games, big home games. Matter of fact, it's the 50th anniversary for NC State's football stadium, and we're hosting Notre Dame, and that was going to be a big event. And the game's still on for now. It's a noon kick on Saturday. If it stays slow, as the European solutions sort of had been putting it, the game could still go on and not be affected by it. But at this point, I know they're planning on discussing it over the next couple of days. They're watching it very closely, and they don't want to put anybody in harm's way or distract people from making preparations, because we have a lot of folks that come from the eastern part of the state that drive into town to tailgate and watch football. So something that we'll be watching very closely. Folks at Carolina doing the same thing. So, and we got a number of other smaller schools that have games in Eastern North Carolina on Saturday. Of course, we've got football, high school football on Friday night. Those games might be affected as well. And you never know what, you think, okay, fine, we'll cancel on Friday and we'll play on Monday, but you never really know what things are going to look like on Monday. If the storm does make a more inland trek, that there may not be, may not make sense to have a game on Monday either. So hopefully this thing stays out to sea and leaves us alone. But we're going to, as our governor says, we're going to prepare for the worst and, hope for the best. We'll under-prepare and hopefully be underwhelmed.
And I've not even looked at the schedules, but if by chance this winds up affecting New England and Boston, the Red Sox are in the playoffs here. And I don't know what the schedule is, but that might be an issue up there Sunday or Monday. Obviously, timing is not known now, but there's just a lot of things going on here. So it's going to be a very fascinating storm to watch, and the world's going to be doing that. And we might even crank out a WeatherBrains special. Well, what did we do those specials for? Remember we did a few of those for
Sandy.
Hurricane?
A couple of them for Sandy.
Yeah, Sandy, that's right. We did some of those for us. Sandy, that was good. All right, so I've got to go in the studio because I'm the lead story, and they're asking me to check this script, and this script I just got, it is a disaster. So, and look, I am very thankful. I am so thankful our producer sends me the scripts so I can check off on them and fix them if I have to, but I got to fix them. So, Nate, I'm going to flip it over to you for Picks of the Week.
All right, well, let's do this quickly, awaiting the 11 o'clock Eastern, 10 o'clock Central Matthew update from the Hurricane Center. My pick of the week at tropicaltidbits.com. Levi Cowan does a fantastic job assembling data, including the recon data and some of the most interesting presentations of recon data, including real-time updating recon on Google Maps. So this is fantastic stuff. So tropicaltidbits.com is mine. Kevin Selly, pick of the week, sir.
I stumbled across this by accident looking for some climate data, and I don't think I had seen it before. It's called WeatherDB, which I think stands for weatherdatabase.com. Yeah. And real clean, nice, easy, loaded with stuff. And so I recommend. You've seen it, Brian?
Yes, I have. I'd never seen that before. That's an interesting site.
Yeah, I don't know where it came from, but it looks pretty good.
All right. Brian Peters, pick of the week.
Yes. Before I get on to my pick, I don't know if you all saw the tweet from Marshall Shepard. It has some interesting information in it from Bill Reed, former director of the National Hurricane Center. And I'm just absolutely floored by the fact that if you look at 6 hurricanes, Hazel, Flora, Allen, Gordon, Jean, and Hannah, Haiti has had over 11,000 deaths in just those 6 storms.
Wow.
And they're going to take the brunt of this one too. So I think a humanitarian disaster is coming about down there. But my pick is the Jamaican weather radar, which I think is actually from Western Cuba. Pardon me, Eastern Cuba. But a lot of interest down there. And I find it very interesting that Matthew is in a very radar sparse area of the Caribbean.
And before Brian stops, Brian, for those who are listening as opposed to watching, I just can't help but looking at your shirt and wondering what the logo of what looks like a duck in a beaker is.
It's the Buck Creek Festival, and we have a duck race. We have rubber ducks, yellow rubber ducks that race down the Buck Creek.
I thought somehow the duck and beaker might have been the show title, but I couldn't quite figure it out.
No.
Aubrey, save us. Bring some class to this conversation.
I love your shirt.
Yes, please.
I love your shirt, Brian. And I think I get the buzzer. I don't have a pick this week.
Oh, okay.
No foghorn.
All right. Well, this has been WeatherBrains. It is the weekly original all about the weather netcast, podcast, what have you here. We normally record this show on Monday nights at 8:30 Central, 9:30 Eastern Time via Google Hangout. You can always watch it live.bigbrainsmedia.com. Find us in your favorite podcast app, iTunes, Stitcher. You built in fantastic thing. I started playing with a podcast app on the iPhone recently, and just sub it in, and it's there, and that's it. I don't have to do any work. It shows up there. So give us a subscription if you enjoyed. I know a lot of folks listening tonight for the first time. If you enjoyed the program, leave us a comment. You can reach out to us. Find us on social media. All of our bios and social media profiles are online at weatherbrains.com. We'd love to hear from you. We're on Facebook. We're on Twitter, on Google+, that sort of thing. Just to find us out, leave us a comment, or send us an email. Email at weatherbrains.com. We'd love
Hey,
to
Nate,
hear from you.
I'll make
Sure.
a quick tease too.
Yes.
I fully expect that sometime in the month of October, we'll have Generation 2 of a WeatherBrains t-shirt.
Ooh.
How's that for a tease?
I like that tease. The first generation looks pretty good. So I got some mileage out of that last weekend.
The company that we use has come a long way. You can pick your own colors now, and they have a lot more different styles. And so I think this one will be equally as good, if not better.
Sounds good. All right, this has been the program. Hope you've enjoyed it. We certainly appreciate Dr. Phil Klotzbach being on the program. Speaking of upcoming guests, we've got a number of great shows coming. Eric Floor from Intellivations will be here next week. 2 weeks, we will have the incoming president of the American Meteorological Society on the program to talk about what's happening during his tenure, which will be the year of 2017. Teachers in Space on October 24th. We're going to be talking drones. One of the original online weather sites is right here in North Carolina. Ray Russell from raysweather.com up in the mountains of North Carolina will be here in the middle of November. We'll, I'm sure, talk about snow forecasting. We'll probably have had some snow in the mountains of North Carolina by then. And then we'll be talking about national weather models and the National Weather Center coming up in early December. If you have a guest suggestion, a lot of our show topics come from guest suggestions from listeners like you. Send us an email at weatherbrains.com. Include contact information for your guest suggestion if you have it. Certainly makes our job easier to find them for you. Thanks again for listening. For Brian Peters, Kevin Selle, James Spann, Aubrey Benovitz, and all of our WeatherBrains team, I'm Nate Johnson. Have a great night. And hopefully Matthew stays away. Bye-bye.
Y'all have a great evening.
Thanks, Brian.
Guys.
Thank y'all.
All right, friends, that was it. Thanks for watching Weather Brains tonight. Got to do some TV news here. We'll be doing Song of the Night on Periscope shortly. My Twitter feed, the theme this week, songs from the year you were born. So thank you guys for watching Weather Brains. We'll see you all next Monday night. Have a great week and God bless. Bye-bye.